Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our one of many training webinars that AgriDry is putting on. For more information, something that you guys can go to, obviously everyone that's on the call this morning, hopefully it's good information or useful information. And we try to cover topics that is helpful so that you're getting the most out of your equipment that you are purchasing from AgriDry, and that you're having the successes and the most efficient system that you can get out of the equipment. My name is Clint Walker. I'm with AgriDry right out of the main office. I am the manager over the field service and tech support. AgriDry now is associated now and a part of the GSI team, so we're excited to be on that side of it as well, and being able to be in that front of that many more people that we can definitely help with storing grain and grain management and being successful doing it that way. Our webinar, if you guys have not already, if you look on the screen, and hopefully you all can see that, I had some technically difficult times here with our internet being down, but hopefully we can go through this here without any problems. But if you have not called in, there's a dial-in number that you see on the screen, and then the conference ID number, passcode that you can get in. So if you guys have not already, definitely get into that for the audio, and then obviously we can go along with the slides as we go through this presentation. This webinar will be recorded, so if you guys want to refer back to it at any time, or have other individuals that would want to look at it later on, it will be a link off of our website on our support page. So it'll be useful information, hopefully, that if you guys need to refer back to it or have anybody else that needs to refer to it, it'll be there if you need. So let's go ahead and get started. This webinar is going to be the three main topics. The first topic that we're going to talk about is freezing grain and the pros and cons associated with that. Freezing grain, obviously, many guys do that. It's been around a very long time. And so we'll talk about a little bit about that and maybe on how our equipment can be more efficient doing that, and possibly, what risks are associated whether you freeze grain or whether you don't. We're also going to talk about managing grain temperature. So obviously trying to cool the grain down going into the winter months that we're going into now. How can we manage those grain temperatures and maybe the procedures and the settings associated with on our controller to help in doing that automatically and to maintain those temperatures throughout the entire bin and getting those temperatures front throughout the entire bin so it's a successful winter storage as well. And then the Hotspot feature on the controller, we're going to talk a little bit about that, what it's used for, when to use it, how it's used, and if that would be beneficial in your operation and in your storage procedure here going throughout the winter months. So obviously the pros with freezing grain, much like if you have a freezer at your home that you keep obviously frozen goods in, it's a very safe way for the most part to keep goods, and it's no different than grain. And that's why guys throughout the winter months, they would kind of give that security to them if they froze the grain throughout the entire bin, that it kind of gave a reassurance that grain was going to be okay. Obviously, just like the freezer in your home, not always does that mean that it's going to be a very good product when you pull that back out. So obviously there's some risk associated with that as you store that grain for long term, especially as guys store the grain longer, maybe into the spring or even the summer, depending on when they have a market for that grain. So like I said, it's been around a very long time, and we're not saying to change your methods if you have a method that's working for you. What I want to point out today is that maybe there's a more efficient way to do that. Maybe instead of freezing the grain, maybe there's a more efficient to store the grain at a little bit warmer temperatures, and I'll kind of go through the benefits with that and how we can store grain a little bit differently with a little bit different temperature scheme than just freezing the grain and running the fans in very cold temperatures to freeze the entire grain bin. So, and like I said, as you freeze that grain and lower that temperature, whether you freeze it below freezing, obviously, conditions, or even very cool conditions. And what I'm going to discuss here today is obviously you eliminate that insect activity and anything during the wintertime months, and that's obviously beneficial when cooling the grain down at that point. So here's one of the cons, I guess, that we always associate with our equipment. So, since everybody has been freezing grains for a very long period of time, for many, many years, because that's how their dad did it, or, that's how they were brought up and it's worked for them. The biggest thing with that is that typically they didn't have any way to monitor the grain temperatures in the grain bin. So if they had no way to monitor that grain temperature, then they're going to have it set up so that they're going to freeze the grain and they know that it's a safe way to do that. Now with the technology and obviously with our style of products, being able to read those grain temperatures from the bottom to the top throughout the entire grain bin, knowing when those temperature fronts have been pushed through the entire grain bin, and an efficient way to do that, gradually cooling that grain down, or obviously going back in the springtime, warming it back up, and having a controller to always monitor that information, that's where it's really changed the idea of freezing grain, all right? So with that, on the screen you see, this is just a storage live chart. This is actually for yellow corn. And what I want to point out here is that as you look across this chart, obviously this is a different grain moisture for yellow corn across the top, high moisture over here and dry grain over here, and there's the different temperatures associated with it. So when we look at what we say or what we recommend for guys, if you're able to, whether they're doing drying early on in the season and they get that moisture dried down of the grain to their desired target moisture going into the winter months, and then they need to cool it down possibly before they go into the winter storage. If you look at this chart that I have outlined, we recommend typically to store your grain at 35 degrees as an average throughout the entire bin, 35, 40 degrees. And the reason being is if you look at this chart that's outlined, this is the number of days that the grain will store at that moisture at that grain temperature. So you look at, you get anything less than 18% or less, you can pick up some considerable amount of time and days over, years essentially, that we can store grain at. And so when guys say I freeze my grain because we can store the grain longer, obviously in the spring or summer, we can also do that as long as we ensure that the moisture and the temperature fronts are pushed throughout the entire bin just by looking at that 35, 40 degrees. So what does that mean, I guess, as far as our equipment and how it can be beneficial for what you're doing in your operation? Think about to get the grain down to below freezing throughout the entire bin compared to 35, 40 degrees. You're going to burn a little more electricity to get it down cooler, to run the fans longer to get it down cooler than if you stop it at that 35, 40 degrees. So there's definitely some electrical savings on that side of it. Being able to monitor those grain temperatures at any time on the controller, and obviously our 80-link communication package that a lot of you guys have, and if you don't, obviously that's an upgrade package that is very helpful for end users to be able to look at their data and their information at any time that it's very easily, readily that they need to look at that information. So they don't actually have to be at the controller necessarily to pull that information up, to look at those grain temperatures, whether it's once a day, whether it's once a week. Their main practice that they do so that they can ensure that their grain is in quality condition for the life of the storage that they're marketing their grain with. So that's the main thing. And we have a lot of guys, obviously, that potentially could store some wetter grain, usually somewhere across the Midwest or our territory, that maybe they don't get that grain dried down in the fall time frame that it requires, and they hit that colder temperature that they can't remove any more moisture because it is below freezing. So we usually somewhere across the country or across the world, as we have our controllers and equipment throughout the world, that there's guys that storing a little wetter grain. And if you notice here, obviously the storage life goes down, but we can still store potentially maybe 3 or 4 months, with the right conditions and cooling that grain down, and we don't necessarily have to freeze that grain. So that's the main point that I want to point out here, is that most of the time grain will store at 35 degrees just as it will at 0 degrees for the most part. So, but we have to make sure that those grain temperature fronts are throughout the entire bin. We can't have those temperature fluctuations throughout the entire bin or from the grain mass to the headspace and all that, because then we're looking at condensation issues that I'll get into a little bit, I think, on the next slide of what we look at. So as we're cooling that grain down with the technology that we have and being able to have those grain temperature sensors from the bottom to the top evenly spaced out, we can see and make sure and maintain that those grain temperatures are very close to each other as you're cooling the grain down. So what happens then, obviously, throughout the winter months, hopefully we hold that grain temperature at, let's say, 35-degree average throughout the winter months. We make it through the winter months, and then it starts warming back up outside. Well, what does that mean as far as grain temperature and what we need to look at for that? Well, anytime that the outside air temperature starts to warm back up outside, and you have that headspace area that's above the grain, if that becomes much more higher than what the grain temperature is, now the potential for condensation can occur. All right, so if you freeze the grain down and you get it very, very cold below freezing conditions, and then it starts to warm back up outside in the spring, that temperature differential you hit that temperature differential much sooner if you freeze the grain down below freezing than if you would at 35 degrees. So essentially, to avoid that condensation from dripping back off the roof and on top of the grain that forms a layer that you see in this picture, and it's also the sidewalls obviously can sweat along with that, and depending on if you don't put any air on it, no aeration, the potential for condensation is much more drastic when the grain is frozen and you have that larger temperature differential than if you have it at 35 degrees. And then going on into the spring and summer, we usually recommend to start warming that grain back up. A little bit at a time, 10 degrees at a shot, and gradually push that temperature front back up. And we usually tell guys to store grain throughout the late spring, summertime at about 55, 60 degrees. And it's usually still cool enough that it eliminates insect activity, as well as it's put that grain temperature a little closer to the outside air temperature so you don't have that large drastic temperature differential from outside to inside temperatures as well. Just it helps along with that. And so back to freezing grain, if you run the fan for a very long period of time and more electrical usage than what's needed to cool it down a lot more below freezing than what's needed, and then you got to warm it back up, those are the two areas that we can definitely help at from our equipment and with our grain temperature management that we can obviously read into the controller and the communication package to help eliminate and make the system the most efficient that you're looking for. And obviously with the market that we're in right now, grain prices, every penny counts, and to manage it and to run it the most efficient way, it just helps obviously on that bottom dollar when you get rid of that grain. So as far as managing grain temperatures, so this is just a copy of the door chart that probably most, if not all, your controllers that you guys would have this on the inside door. If you don't have this, it's kind of a cheat sheet, something kind of quick and easy that kind of goes over what we would recommend for storage mode, and obviously we have the drying mode as well, but I'm highlighting the storage mode on the right side. And you notice with those different storage mode seasons, we have a winter season, a spring and fall, and a summer. And you notice that we're changing obviously the minimum maximum air temperature setting and the target grain temperature setting that we program into the controller. And the reason we do that is obviously going into the winter months, we want to tighten that min and max air temperature down for the controller to operate. Obviously the minimum maximum air temperature allows whatever the outside air temperature has to be between those two figures before it can operate in automatic. And so we make sure that it's running when it's cooler, as well as you look at this target grain temperature setting, that 35 degrees, that's the end goal that we want the average grain temperature to be for that temperature front. So it would run the fans until your average grain temperature is 35 degrees in winter storage. And once that 35 degrees plus or minus 5 degrees is what we use with a window. So we're not shooting for one direct temperature, we're shooting for a window. So in this case, we'd be shooting for 30 to 40 degrees. It's going to bring that grain temperature down within that range, and once it's there, it's going to say, I don't need to run the fans anymore. Your average temperature is where you need it. If at any time that it raises or goes below or above that range of 30 to 40 in this case, whenever the conditions are such that it could run the fans with all the parameters set in the controller, then it would either try to cool it back down or warm it back up or whatever they're doing. So that's the great thing about the controller. It's always monitoring that grain temperature and ensuring that it's staying within the range that you have set up for your target temperature. Spring and fall, obviously we went through fall, but usually in the fall time, guys will start cooling grain down, so that's why it's set at 45, and then they go into winter, we just drop it another 10 degrees and just keep cooling it down and pushing that temperature front from the bottom to the top, and we can see that. Obviously going back into the spring, we would do the same thing. We're going to widen out our maximum air temperature setting so we get a little warmer air, but not a lot, so it doesn't put really high temperature. If we had a really warm spring, it doesn't put really high temperature across cooler grain, so we don't have that condensation issue on that as well. But then we're going to gradually warm that grain back up about 10 degrees. And if you're going to store into summer, then we're looking at the target of 55 degrees, what we talked about. So that's how we're able to cool it down going into winter, coming out of fall, and then back up into the spring and summer, and a very efficient way to ensure that the controller will make sure that the grain temperatures are within the range that you're looking for. Along with that, when you go into storage mode at any point, whether you're right out of the field at the right moisture or right out of the dryer that's at the right moisture, whatever the case is, you have to look at your grain temperature sensors and make sure that they're all in the grain. So whether your bin wasn't completely full or if it was full but there's still a sensor, depending on where that sensor is located on the cable, is out of the grain, or if you started unloading the bin at any point throughout the winter months or any time and it started exposing some of the grain sensors on the temperature cables, go through your temperature cables, whether on the screen on the controller like you see here or on the 80-link communication package if you have that right on the internet. But if you look at this example, this is a perfect example that on a bright sunshiny day, maybe throughout the winter months, your grain temperature is an average of 36 degrees, all in the 30s, but that last sensor is 57. And that's an alarm to us and as well as to you that says, okay, let's look at the outside air temperature. And if that number 6 sensors reading at least the outside air temperature or higher, then we know it's probably out of the grain. So we need to deselect that sensor. And if you notice, there's no X beside that sensor. Only the first 5 sensors are selected and actually are in the grain, and that's the only ones that will use into the average grain temperature to ensure that it's using an accurate average grain temperature so that when you're trying to control the fans automatically with storage mode, it's doing that efficiently for you and not triggering the fans on when it shouldn't be because it's taking in some higher temperatures into the average. So always think about that. And that's probably the biggest thing as well as maybe as grain, starts to be removed out of the grain bins, some guys will forget to go in and deselect those sensors. But always monitor them, always look at them. That's a great thing about an 80-link communication package is that you can pull it up at any time at your fingertips and just a quick glance to say, hey, here's my grain temperature is one now looks like it's out of the grain, but you can deselect or select any of them at any point to help manage your average grain temperature throughout the entire bin. So Hotspot Mode. Hotspot Mode is another feature on the Bullseye controller to help when there's high temperature and high moisture in the grain bin. And what I mean by that, perfect examples of Hotspot Mode would be, let's say you use drying, let's say you put 22% moisture corn in the bin, and you remember that storage life chart, if the grain temperatures was up in the 60s or 70s at the point of harvest and you have 22% moisture grain in the bin, that storage life for that grain is obviously considerably less until you get that grain moisture out or until you cool it down. And so let's say that top portion of the bin is not quite dried yet because you haven't pushed that drying front throughout the entire bin yet, and you're going into the winter months or the fans are starting to shut off more because it's starting to go below freezing and you can't remove moisture anymore at that point. So that's a perfect example of when Hotspot Mode could be and should be used, is when you have higher moisture grain like that has a lower shelf life and maybe the grain temperatures aren't quite cooled down yet. So it just gives that added protection so that when the fans are shut off, because either it's maybe below freezing conditions or really high humidity outside, and it's, it wouldn't really be doing much good when the fans are running at that point. If it sees that the temperatures on any one of the grain temperature sensors on the cables that you have in reading into the controller, if it sees that it sees a rise in temperature, which I'll go through the individual settings here in a little bit, that it triggers it as a hotspot, it will override the fans being shut off, and it will turn them on because it thinks it has a hotspot and to help protect that grain. So it's that added bonus, added feature that we have in the controller for those type of years or for those situations that you may run into storing the grain throughout those winter months. I think the biggest thing that guys will do with Hotspot is they'll turn it on just for an added bonus or an added feature, added protection. But if they have dry grain in the bin or especially cool temperatures, that's not the ideal time to use it. It's just, yes, it's there to help protect, but it's almost overkill essentially to run that, because what will happen then is as they pull grain out of the bin, or if they forget to deselect sensors, then it's going to think it has hot spots because those temperature cables or sensors are out of the grain as they become exposed, and then it's turning the fans on when they don't want to, when it's a bright sunshiny day and warming up that headspace, and that's where guys usually will get the most trouble and the most complaints typically because they forget to deselect or they have that temperature fluctuation of temperature sensors that's out of the grain. So always remember that. But like I said, it does override it. It is a feature there. Like I said, we always tell guys, use Hotspot mode when you have higher temperatures or higher moistures in the bin. If you have cool temperatures and dry grain, that's not the time to use Hotspot, and it's really not needed, especially when we have the other features with the storage mode and being able to monitor temperatures and cool it down with the average grain temperature. So this is what the Hotspot controls look like on the screen, and it looks very similar on the AgriDry communication if you guys are familiar with that. But there's mainly three settings. Once you enable the Hotspot controls like you see here, once you turn Hotspot controls on, there's a trip degrees, a drop degrees, and a hot timeout. And so whenever the fans turn off in automatic, it logs all the grain temperature that they're reading at that point on the memory on the board. And while the fans are off, if it sees that any one of those temperature sensors that you have selected with an X, remember it's very crucial to make sure that you have the sensors that's in the grain selected with an X, because if the ones that are out of the grain are selected with an X, it's going to treat it as a grain sensor. But if it sees that any one of those sensors that are selected raise 10 degrees in this situation, these are the settings that we would recommend for Hotspot. If it sees it raise 10 degrees, it's going to say, hey, whatever sensor in the bin, there would be an error message on the screen as well as on AgriDry communication if you have that. And it would say, hey, this sensor on this cable triggered it as a hot spot because it has increased 10 degrees from when the fan shut off the last time. So it's going to trigger the fans on no matter what the conditions are outside. And it's got to take that sensor that triggered as a hot spot back down 8 degrees, which is the drop degrees, before we say, okay, we're back into normal or back in control of that temperature, all right? And then we allow so much time to do that, because if it's a bigger issue than what we can control, bigger hot spot than what we can control, we don't want to just be running fans and fans and fans if it's not going to do any good, if it's a much larger issue, instead of maybe pulling some grain out of the bin or something like that. So we give it a timeout, which is in minutes, 60 minutes, for that to happen. Now, every time that it drops a degree, it'll reset that timer, so essentially it could run up to 8 hours at that point, if need be, if it did not cool the grain down from the trip degrees to the drop degrees. So these are the settings, obviously, that's also on the AgriDry communication. They're called the same thing, so you could set it up from there. But like I said, it is an added feature. If you need it, for those times that you are going to be storing some winter grain throughout the winter months and your fans are shutting off because of the outside conditions are changing for the winter conditions, and it's just that added feature that you can help monitor that as well. I kind of leave it up to the customer as well. How often are you going to be checking the temperatures? Me personally, if I had some winter grain in the bin, I would definitely be checking the temperatures, especially with the communication package, probably at least once or you know, every other day or something, to make sure that your temperatures are holding where you need to be. Getting that management, you know, just doing those checks, honestly, because there's nothing more important than even climbing to the top of the bin and poking your head in the manhole at the top, you know, maybe putting a little bit of air from the fans and just looking, you know, taking that visual, smelling, making sure everything is good across the bin and cool temperatures as you're going through those winter months. Obviously, the grain temperatures will only read right around those grain temperature sensors, so, you know, if there's no, you know, if halfway across the bin you don't have a temperature cable, it would take a very long time to get to the temperature cable. So there's nothing more important than doing those visual checks as well. But at least on the temperature cable, you can see what those temperature levels are as long as you have consistent airflow all the way across the bin. So that's the hotspot feature. It can be used, and it can be there if needed for those scenarios that we talked about. Our support is always there. As far as our tech support team here in the office, usually here from 8 to 5 Eastern Time. Outside of those hours, I know even myself and the owner, Eli, as well, has taken calls. The tech support team has taken calls outside of the office. So we try to make ourselves readily available for you guys to either help with settings, help understand the system, so that you have it set up correctly for what you need to at your facility. So always remember that tech support line. It should be a lot of, especially the newer controllers, will have it right on the inside door of the controller. So there's a number there. You see the number here at the bottom of the screen, 419-459-4399. That's the main office number here. So like I said, if you have any tech support questions or regarding anything at any time, let us know, and we definitely want to help you out and get you the resources, hopefully, that you know, that you need for your operation. Obviously, our website, agridryllc.com/support. That's where our links are, a lot of them, for all the webinars that we do, like today, as well as our topics of the week and anything new going forward as we do new webinars about certain topics. All that can be associated off of our website. We do have a YouTube channel that obviously has a link, direct link with that as well. But that YouTube link obviously is right off our website as well to get to those videos and webinars that we hold. So use that support to your advantage and to help understand the equipment and get the value out of your equipment that you're looking for. So that's everything that we're going to talk about today as far as the webinar. I'm going to open up the lines. We do have discounts available, so talk to the AgriDry dealers across in your area. If you need numbers or contact names for dealers in your area, or the management sales managers that are over those territories as well that work for us, we definitely want to get you guys in contact with that if you guys need any help with any of that. But there are some winter discounts going on right now, so take advantage of that if you're looking for any new equipment or any upgrades. Obviously, all of that applies through the discount structure as well. So our toll-free number at the very bottom, 855-AgriDry. That gets us into the main office here as well. And so use those numbers and contact information anytime. I'm going to open the lines, guys, so if you have any questions about what we talked about today, definitely ask. If you have any other questions while we're on the line regarding anything else with the AgriDry equipment, you know, I would love to help out, I guess, on the line as well, and I will let you know when the lines are open, so just hang on. I believe the lines are unmuted, so if anyone has any questions, please ask them now. Hopefully it was some good information for you guys that were on today. And like I said, this is a recorded video, so if you need to refer back to it or have anybody else look at it, it will be a link off of our website to be able to access as well. So use that information whenever you need. I'm going to end the call and end the webinar. I appreciate everybody coming on today and taking part in the webinar. And look for future webinars as well about different topics. And we will be sending out notices when those will be coming online as well. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming on, and everyone have a safe day. Thank you.
Thank you.